Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is Jeff. Jeff, what's going on?
Chris, good to be here again. Really excited to be on the show. And we've got one of my favorite people in the world, Lara Pierpoint, today. So I'm super excited to get to talk to her more.
I am super excited. It's been great having you start co-hosting some of these shows with us. You're bringing some amazing guests along. And I think you know Lara from a past life or from crossing paths. So why don't you give us a little background of who we're going to speak to today?
Yes. So Lara Pierpoint has about 3 degrees from MIT, including a PhD in engineering systems, nuclear engineering. So super sophisticated on the technical side. And if her voice sounds familiar, it's because she's been guest hosting on another one of my favorite podcasts, Catalytic, where she's filled in for Shale Khan from time to time. I actually had the chance to be interviewed on that show by Lara. So I'm thrilled actually to be able to turn around the microphone and ask her some questions, because Lara is starting on a new initiative that I don't think has really been announced yet. She's in a new role where she's using Philanthropic Capital to accelerate early climate infrastructure. And we need to ask her a ton of questions to explain this, because it's really, really exciting. Can we bring Lara in?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Lara, good to see you. Welcome. How did we do on that introduction? Is that reasonably accurate?
That was great, Jeff. Other than the fact that I'm blushing, that was overly nice. But no, I'm really excited to be here today.
This is great. Well, help orient us right away. We're going to get into more of your background, but just at the top, because you have such a really interesting challenge that you're working on. You're using flexible capital to address valleys of debt. Tell us what the mission is and a little bit about the organization that you're working on now.
Absolutely. So I think, taking it back to the highest levels, the thing that I've been obsessed about for the last really 10 years is the fact that climate tech is awesome, but it's not scaling fast enough. One of the things that I love to say is that, we don't really get points on the board until we're actually at deployment scale and meaningfully reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to do that more, and we need to do it faster in the climate tech world. So as some folks who have been watching may know, that's why I built a nonprofit called Actuate Climate. The idea was to really kind of break down systems barriers and figure out what are the problems really that fall through the cracks that are hard or, too big for startups to solve, and that the government maybe should solve but isn't. And that's really what we were working on. So I'm keeping that same vision. But the other thing that's happened over the last couple of years is that this is obviously a problem that more and more organizations are starting to focus on. And it turns out that the Prime Coalition in particular is also really thinking about this. And I think, as some folks may know, the special sauce with the Prime Coalition is that they've really pioneered catalytic investing in the climate space. And they've done this sort of for early stage climate companies and are continuing to do that for early stage climate companies, but have been wondering, what can they do to really help at later stages? So as they've been asking and answering that question, and as I've been obsessing about this systems approach to getting to scale, we realized that really we could do so much more if we combine our organizations. And so that's what's happening. And actually today is officially my first day as a Prime employee building what we're calling the Early Climate Infrastructure Program. And this really combines the vision of systems innovation with Actuate and the catalytic investing abilities at Prime to really enable us to do more for climate tech.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations. If this is launch day, so it's Prime ECI. What a fantastic home. And the venture arm that you mentioned is Azola ventures, correct?
Correct.
So there's, I think, been a few podcasts over on My Climate Journey if people are curious about Azola. So maybe we'll link to that. But the mission for Prime is really all about using philanthropic capital. So you're not doing venture investing. The goal is not to do a venture. So within the Prime umbrella of utilizing philanthropic capital, Azola is the venture arm, ECI, Early Climate Infrastructure. What's that vehicle? What's the capital vehicle going to be there?
Yeah, I think the shortcut way to think about us is project finance, right? So really growth finance, I think is probably a better, more all encompassing term. So we're really here thinking about the climate companies that need to figure out what to do once they outgrow venture. So whether that involves, a huge CapEx project that is going to require traditional sources of project finance, or whether they need to start figuring out how to go from manufacturing tens of things to thousands of things. I think the question is, what is the kind of financing they would or could need to grow? And then is there something we can do to help unlock that financing, since, as folks are starting to note, this is a huge valley of death for the climate tech world?
What kind of aptitude is there in the market to do this kind of funding? So is it corporate? Is it individual wealthy folks? I mean, where is the capital to do this coming from?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple answers to that question. On the traditional financing side, I would say there are some venture capitalists who have bigger funds and who are willing to kind of go and push later stage and think about what comes next. So Breakthrough Energy Ventures, they obviously have Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, which has the ability to get into this space. There's another great example at Energy Impact Partners, where Shale Khan is. Everybody's connected here, of course. They've got a team now that's thinking about how to help get some of their companies into the project finance world. There are certain project financiers that are willing to lean forward, particularly on climate, and take on some of the bigger risks essentially that are there for some of the earlier climate technologies. And some of those that come to mind pretty consistently are Generate Capital, Springlane Capital. There's Galway. There are a couple other folks who are starting to think in this direction too, and are willing to take a little bit more of the riskier portfolio. So that's what we're looking to in terms of partners and folks who we think are going to help pioneer what needs to happen for the climate tech space. And then on the philanthropic side, I would say there's a big array of foundations and family offices. A lot of folks who have grown up in the Silicon Valley tech world who really want to help with climate, and they're all starting to ask the question, what can they do that is the best bang for their buck? How can they really leverage their precious philanthropic dollars to do something really meaningful for climate? So it's a really exciting moment to be in this space, and I think we have a lot of potential to start moving the world toward doing the kind of project finance and growth stage funding that these companies are going to need.
Now, is this like a drop in the ocean? Because I mean, you probably could use trillions of dollars to do what you're talking about, to build and scale globally, right? So, how early is this, and how big of impact do you? I mean, you just started a new role, so you're obviously very excited about it and optimistic where it's going to go. Um, how much capital is out there looking to do this? Is there anything close to what we might need to make an impact?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think, there are a couple of answers to this. One is that, yes, when it comes to actually, reinvigorating all of our infrastructure and all of our economies globally in order to combat climate change and really get to net zero, absolutely, you're talking about trillions of dollars. When you're talking about this sort of particular challenge that we're focused on right now, this question of how do you really get through those growth stages and into your early deployment, I would say the problem is smaller, but it's still big. I don't have an exact number for you, but I think the other sort of interesting thing that's starting to happen is that you see, private equity funds and a lot of this sort of later stage finance organizations, they're really interested in climate. They want to do ESG funding. They really want to be doing things that are good for the planet, and they're struggling to find projects that are clearly bankable for them to do. So what's interesting is that there's sort of this like later stage money that's on some level sitting on the sidelines waiting for things to really feel ready and de-risked for them. And then there are all these technologies that can't quite get off the ground far enough to access all of that funding. So it's really a question of bridging that gap. And I would say that right now we don't have a great sense for exactly how big it is. But I think the nice thing again is that what we're seeing is that there's philanthropic money, there's more risk seeking project finance money. There's all sorts of stuff that's starting to come to the table here and recognize that this is an issue. So I think we're going to find out soon, whether the balance is on the side of we need more money or we need better technologies or, some combination depending on your particular focus area.
Right. And the order of magnitude we're talking about here, Lara, correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of, tens of millions of catalytic capital to mobilize hundreds of millions of project capital. And what you've highlighted there is really about the stage. There's lots of capital on the sidelines for the sector, but maybe just not at the stage where it's a little bit too early. But let's get into some examples, because I know you've got a very well-refined pipeline. So tell us about some of the technologies that you're looking at, the sort of poster child of what an early climate infrastructure project might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would probably edit that a little bit just to say that we've got a pipeline, but we are really asking lots of questions. So refined is maybe not the word for it right now. Big and messy and trying to understand the space is really a more accurate description. But some of the things we're thinking about, I think an obvious one that comes to mind is carbon dioxide removal, because this is a space that I think increasingly we're all recognizing we're going to need to do this to some degree. And one of the things that makes it incredibly difficult is that the demand signals are all over the place right now. There clearly is a market for carbon dioxide removal credits. There are certain companies willing to spend a lot of money per ton to support early stage technologies. There are more companies that are curious about this space but don't have the bandwidth or the aptitude to really figure out how to play in a way that's going to be meaningful. So this is a really tricky area, and there are a lot of companies with some really great ideas on how to do this, and shortly they're going to need funding for pilots and bigger demonstration projects. This is a place where the Department of Energy has a lot of money that they're going to be flowing into this space, particularly for big demos. But there are some questions out there about what about the smaller companies? What, are they really going to get the venture capital they need to get through all of the paces and get to the stage where they're ready for a large scale DOE funded demo? So this is part of what we're tracking and working on understanding is what are really the gaps in terms of getting some of these pilot and first commercial projects off the ground. I think it's important to recognize as we do that it's not just about the financing of these projects. It really is about this gnarly question on the demand side. And so I think part of what we are planning to do with ECI is to really look critically at the whole sector and understand what can we do that's going to be beneficial to help these projects get to scale. Is it project finance? Is it project finance and some funding to really start to rationalize carbon markets? How do we think about the really important equity questions that are on the table, particularly for sequestration related technologies when it comes to community engagement and community decision making? And so those are going to be some things that we're going to directly grapple with and hopefully try to fund some solutions for some of those challenges.
I want to come back to the government intervention in a little bit, but just on CDR for a second, there are some initiatives out there where it's really about the green premium. Oh, we can get CDR to market. All it takes is paying $2,000 a ton. It sounds like you have a different approach that is really more about focused on technology piloting. How would you say that better?
Well, I think we're thinking about both. So definitely the technology piloting is a really critical piece of this. And I think, part of what with every sector, all of these things are integrated. One of the things that the demand side of the equation wants to know is how expensive is CDR and what am I really getting when I buy a CDR credit? So one important thing to note here is that it's actually not just about the price per ton when it comes to a CDR credit, because there is huge variation across technology solutions in how permanent that sequestration is. How much can you rely on it still being there? There are also big differences in how much measurement uncertainty is there when you're actually, pulling this down from the atmosphere. So I think, the goal here is to think about what do we do to make sure there are enough technology options available, enough solutions available, and that involves, financing some of these through their early stage commercialization paces. But at the same time, we really need to figure out how can we stabilize and clarify and ultimately expand the market for credits on the other side through both government purchases and voluntary purchases. And so the goal ultimately is going to be to work on both.
Right. And I want to make sure we don't completely spend all the time on CDR because it's a fascinating topic and one where honestly there are folks working on insurance products to mitigate some of those risks as well. But for folks listening who somebody might be working on a CDR technology or a marketplace, it sounds like it's not just technology limited. It would also be more on that deployment or market making side as well. How early is too early? there's a lot of people starting to draft emails to you. So is there a stage that's too soon, or you're listening to anybody?
Yeah, I mean, right now we're listening to just about anybody. I will say that if folks are kind of squarely in the mode of like we need venture capital to grow our business, then that's something that falls into Azola's remit. So there is a catalytic capital solution for you, I guess, is what I would say. But for anyone who's thinking about those growth phases, again, who are getting signals from their VC investors that you're outgrowing the VC world, who are really starting to think about other kinds of sources of revenue, really get in deep with your customers, then the question becomes, what kind of financing is right for your next growth step? And I would say the really critical thing for us in talking to companies is it's important that the companies have asked and answered that question with traditional finance to some degree, that they've really explored what are the sources of capital out there, the sources of funding out there that I could really leverage for my next step. And it's if you're starting to get the hints that you're too risky because of some technology issue or some other challenge that you're facing, that this might not work in your next phase, that's the place where philanthropic capital and money can really come in and I think make a big difference.
That's great. So give us another example, because I think CDR is a very specific, you've got a really articulated thesis, well-articulated thesis there. What else? Because you've also got a pretty wide remit of things you can look at.
Yeah, so I think the electricity grid is kind of a great sort of example in some ways on the other side of the spectrum from CDR. It's just very different challenges. So the grid space is near and dear to my heart, given my background in the electric utility industry, and I think the challenges there are very different. I think what you see in the electric utility world is that every territory is different, and if you've managed to sell your product to one utility, you've managed to sell to one utility. And there are a lot of companies out there who have been very successful and have really cool technologies that are helping to stabilize the grid. They're helping to bring on carbon free resources, but it's really painful to sell to every single utility and to go into different territories. It's a completely different regulatory system that you have to understand. The markets are structured differently. It's really hard. So one of the things we've been thinking a lot about is demand flexibility on the grid. So this is the idea that you can use your electricity when renewables are available, or you can allow the utility to make minute, controlling actions within some of the electricity usage that you have in order to support grid stability in a way that enables more people to connect their EVs and electrify their homes. So a lot of cool stuff that you can do with demand flexibility. But again, it's really hard because you've got utility players in different territories. You've got other kinds of stakeholders. There's questions about the regulatory environment. In many cases, the market incentives don't exist in many territories to actually start implementing demand flexibility, even though it could be very inexpensive and very powerful in supporting decarbonization. So this is one of the things that we've been thinking about. And here, part of what we're seeing is that there are a lot of great companies with great technologies and solutions. What they, I think, need most of all is more standardization and clarity on where the market is going to go, ideally across the US and ultimately globally, so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they're selling something new. So we've got some ideas that are more about kind of digging in on the system side of things and really demonstrating that there are some simple architectures to do this. And then from our very unique nonprofit perspective, being able to gather everyone and saying, hey, we don't have an ultimate commercial dog in this fight. We just want to see this space work out. And we want to see this be a space where there are a lot of different great ideas that can grow and flourish. So can we start demonstrating some things that are easily standardizable across the system and help this area grow?
So is that a combination of policy as well as just getting the stakeholders together, so the utilities together to agree to try this? Because I being in energy and being in electricity and working with grids, I 100% see, if you weren't watching the video, I think all of us were nodding the whole time you were giving that description of the challenges. So it seems like a fairly difficult track that you guys are choosing to do, right? There's a lot of great companies, a lot of them been on this podcast doing really great things with demand response, but how do you get the utilities to listen?
That's a great question. Having formerly been at a utility, hopefully I have a leg up on this, but I think, I think it comes down to this. I think utilities act in a couple of interests. One is obviously their own financial interests, but the other is really that it's about reliability and service to customers. They are required to, and actually, I think at their core, they care about keeping the lights on and they care about serving electricity to people, because at the end of the day, that's such a foundational requirement for living. So I think the goal here is really to demonstrate to utilities that there is value to be had in demand flexibility, whether or not current market incentives allow them to reap that value. And once we can hopefully show that, no matter what your particular grid configuration is, you can get at, better electrification, you can get at higher reliability, you can get at a lot of the metrics that you care about, and you can even potentially, optimize how you use the grid edge according to whether you care more about something like decarbonization or about grid reliability in any given moment, that this really offers an incredibly powerful opportunity and frankly a cost savings and or even new revenue opportunity for utilities. And if we can show that, my hope is that that's enough to get utilities to become, instead of sort of somewhere between neutral to hostile to these ideas, to actually start supporting them and working with their regulators to make the changes required to really scale these kinds of technologies.
And it seems that it's a little bit of the Wild West right now, right? There's so many companies that I talk to that think they're going to dominate this space, that are really going out and they're working with a utility or working with the ratepayer to try to get some sort of deal, or someone else, maybe it's a EV manufacturer or General Motors or some company that wants to maybe control kind of some of that. Um, how is that shaping up? So, utilities aren't your only stakeholder, I would think, at this point, right? There's a lot of competition rolling into this space. So, from your vantage point, are you seeing it kind of shake up? Or are we still way far away from any kind of rationalization and bringing things together? Because I mean, I hear all kinds of great ideas almost every week.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're raising some great points. There's sort of I guess the benefit and the curse of this space is because it's so hard to sell to new utilities and in new territories. On some level, that's allowed a lot of different ideas to flourish because it's not easy to just kind of corner the market immediately across the whole U.S. So I think that's the good thing, is that we're seeing a lot of really incredible work that's happening out there. Again, the bad thing is that to really get all of this stuff to scale meaningfully in a way that's actually affecting greenhouse gas emissions, we do have to start rationalizing and narrowing down and having fewer solutions and more alignment among utilities. I think it's going to take a long time to get there. I'm hoping that the programs and the work that we're contemplating doing, we have some really amazing funding from Schmidt Futures specifically to focus on this work. And our goal is to really kind of try to align everyone and start trying to move this space forward to a clear vision for doing demand flexibility in a way that's going to enable a couple of solutions to really flourish, and ideally to have some innovation on kind of the edges of that. So hopefully we'll get this going faster. And I know that there's a lot of work that's starting to happen in many utility territories and other regulatory markets across the country. So hopefully that'll start to change, that there will be more momentum behind this. But honestly, I think it's going to take a while.
Yeah. So we talked about a more narrow technology-specific vertical like CDR. We talked about a little bit of a meta category, which is demand flexibility, different technological solutions, but the barrier being how they integrate and interface with the utility as a second category. I have a feeling you've got a lot more. But we probably won't have time to go through all of those. Is there a place where people can find a list of those? Are you planning to publish those somewhat? For example, you mentioned Breakthrough Energy Catalyst. They have a list of a few areas: clean hydrogen, long duration energy storage, sustainable aviation fuel, direct air capture. Do you have a similar list that you're working on that people will be able to see?
We probably will ultimately have a list. I'm not sure yet, though, honestly, whether we're going to publish that for everyone. I think certainly right now we're early enough that any and all ideas, as long as they're decarbonization, or I should say greenhouse gasification related. Really wish there were a better word for that. But anything that reduces greenhouse gases, come see us, please. And at some point, there are going to be areas that we're going to have some priority focus on. We know what some of those are already. We're sort of working on figuring out what those are going to be. But we're really interested in learning at this point. And I think, and I'm not sure that we'll ever get to a place where it's like, if you have an idea that's outside the specific list, we won't talk to you. They've got to be big. They've got to have the potential to really make a difference globally. I think that's really the key thing for us.
And what is that way? Normally on this show, Chris, you've sculpted it so that it's not making a pitch, but given that Lara is working for a nonprofit trying to deploy early, I think we can let this be a little bit more of a pitch. So where do people find you, Lara? Do you want an email, a DM on Twitter? Like what? There's just all sorts of people. You've basically thrown the doors wide open.
Yes,
If you're
check out the Prime.
early, yeah,
Check out the
please.
Prime Coalition website. There's actually a web form there. So if you're a company and you've got a great idea and you suspect you might essentially require some version of philanthropic support to get through your next growth phases, you think you might be a fit for ECI, there's a web form you can fill out, and that'll go straight to us. And that's a great way to get a hold of us.
Wonderful. So we're going to get that in the show notes for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But before we go into another technology area, we have to zoom out a little bit on your background, because you've seamlessly transitioned between very, very complex technical topics. So, and you've also, we're going to get to the government piece, I promise. So you've worked at a major utility in an innovation group, you've worked in government. So it seems like you've actually touched a lot of the different pieces and can bring those to bear. So how did you get here? Right. And it seems like your current perspective is informed in a lot of ways by that journey.
Yeah, I joke with people sometimes. You can tell I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, because I've literally, like, not only have I gone to different places, but it's different whole sectors, from academia to government to the corporate world and now the nonprofit world. But I think the theme that has connected all of this is that I've been chasing impact. I really care about doing everything I can to stop climate change. And so when I was in academia, I loved what I was doing. I had a lot of fun doing research, but I really was itching to do something that was going to be a little bit more proximally, I guess, relevant in terms of stopping climate change. And so I thought, I'm going to go to DC. I'm going to help do this through policy. 1 year in Congress taught me very quickly that I wasn't going to be doing that on any sort of short time frame. I learned a ton, but, then also spent some time at DOE and thought, in order to really be effective at policy or in order to do things that are real, I need to be where the real decisions are getting made on installed infrastructure in the world. And so that was what led me to a utility. And I worked for Exelon for almost 5 years. And my goal there was to understand, how does innovation happen in a big utility, and or why or how doesn't it happen, and how do folks think about their role in decarbonization. And it was such an amazing front row seat to all of that kind of decision making. I got really lucky and landed in the perfect spot to understand and work on those issues. And I think it was really through my time in all of those places that I started noticing that, hey, we're doing some really incredible things, as a world, and particularly in the US, to help with some of the early stage technology valleys of death for climate tech, but we're not doing nearly enough to get them all the way across the finish line to deployment stage. And some of those later stages where things get harder, where the money is, bigger, you just have like more resources that are required to get through the next phase. There just aren't as many organizations that are heavily focused on making those transitions happen. So that was what I got really passionate about, and that was ultimately what led me to the nonprofit sector, was saying this is the most flexible place to do what I think needs to get done to solve the problem, and that's why I'm here.
Very cool. So now we have to talk about the IRA bill, right? And the government initiatives that are out. So there's new rafts of tax credits. There's Office of Clean Energy Deployment Demonstration, OCD. What are they calling it now?
Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations.
Demonstration.
Yeah.
And then there's maybe going to be $27 billion out there for green banks. So you're aware of the constellation. So now you mentioned before the generates or the spring lanes on the project finance side. You mentioned Breakthrough Catalyst on the philanthropic side. Now let's talk about the alphabet soup on the government pieces. How do you interface or relate to the DOE OSID, for example?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, maybe just taking one quick step back. I just want to celebrate a win right now for the climate world. Like, let's talk about how unreal it is that you just said what you said, Jeff. Like, I feel like 5 years ago, if someone had said to me, "Do you believe that the federal government will pass a raft of really incredibly powerful, high funding opportunities that are going to make a huge difference in climate?" I would have laughed at you. And like, this is incredible that this has happened. So it's really exciting. It's a huge amount of money. There are a number of different mechanisms. This is obviously an administration that is leaning forward incredibly hard on the issue of climate. So I'm really excited about everything I'm seeing, first and foremost. Getting specifically to your question around OSED, so this is one piece of the puzzle, this Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And here I think it's important to recognize that this is kind of new territory on some level for DOE. I think DOE has done demonstrations over the years. DOE has generally been known for the failures, frankly, in those administrations. Like we think back to, 10 years ago or however long ago it was, and we had Future Gen, which was meant to be the next carbon capture and sequestration. And these are the kinds of projects, the Kemper facility, I'm giving all CCS examples, but DOE, I think, has had a history of struggling, frankly. And it's hard when you've got really big, complex projects and a lot of, government bureaucracy that is there for good reason to protect taxpayers, but ultimately makes these things very hard to do. Um, so it's been tough. There have been a lot of reasons that DOE over the years has been pushed into mostly scientific territory, sort of the earlier stage funding of things. So the fact that this administration, this Secretary of Energy, this Congress is leaning forward and doing demonstrations is huge and so important. And I think as messy and as hard as it might be, this is what the world needs right now. This is this is what we need in order to solve the climate problem. So, within OSED, I think they're still getting set up. They're figuring out how they're going to deploy money. They're taking on some of the existing demonstration programs. So one of them, for example, is the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program that's been built up with the Office of Nuclear Energy and now transferred to OSED. They're really thinking about how to build up not just the capability to do funding, but also the analytic capabilities to be able to really understand the space, understand the commercial issues at stake, and ultimately help let that drive how they're going to spend their money and how they're going to manage their projects. I think one of the biggest things that they're trying to do is bring in people who have real project management and finance experience so that they can support doing these projects a lot better. So I have a lot of hope for what's going on with what they're doing, but I think it is also still pretty early days. In terms of how
I
we,
think
oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I think it's pretty interesting when you talk about that, because if I think back from historically from like DOE and back when the United States was driving nuclear energy around the world back, go back not that long ago, go back to maybe Reagan era or even before, and we were pushing the world to go nuclear. And and it was done not as open and transparent as this. So what's refreshing about what I heard you say, and maybe I'm a bit pessimistic of how the past worked out, is just so many players and so many sets of eyeballs and communication and different folks in where this is more maybe open because of the technologies coming in. So to me, that seems like a very different game as we take this out. And I happen to be today sitting in Europe as we're talking. And so the regulation that we talked about, it's impacted the world, right? It already impacts folks here. When I sit and talk to folks locally, they're like, yeah, that clearly is a huge, not a step ahead, but like a leap ahead of where Europe is today. So it's really transformative. So I'm pretty happy about what I'm hearing. It seems pretty exciting
Yeah,
times.
no, it definitely is. Yeah. No, and I think, and Jeff, you asked too about how we would relate to OSED. And I think the answer there is that, I'm not out here to try to duplicate with philanthropic dollars what the government is doing. So I think again, really exciting. We're tracking and watching really closely. What are the things they're funding? How are they funding it? Who are the folks who are actually interested and can work with DOE funding? But there's a lot that makes working with DOE challenging. And certain companies, if they don't have the resources to interface with the government, because it's no joke to fill out, funding applications and actually do all of the reporting and management that's required under a DOE grant. So there are some big questions like that. There's some questions around where DOE is ultimately going to focus its energy and what may or may not get left behind. So we're working really hard to make sure that we're going to be complementary to their efforts.
And being able to fill in the gaps, right? So
Right.
that advanced reactor demonstration projects, I'm looking at the OSED website, 2.5 billion for there, 2.5 billion for carbon capture demonstration project, but that's not necessarily going to go fast.
Right.
And so maybe some of what you can do is being the flexible, nimble capital to help companies get to that, live long enough to get to that stage and maybe be ready when they get there to receive some of that bigger funding.
Yeah.
That's super exciting. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground. This is really amazing. So I want to make sure we give you the chance, give you a little bit of a grab bag opportunity here. You do have a history in nuclear. There are demonstration projects that are funded there out of OSED. There's been some shade thrown around on other podcasts about modular nuclear reactions. I won't get into the debate about what is small or not small. Do you want to weigh in on any of those topics or another topic that is maybe close to your historic training?
Sure. I mean, let's talk nuclear. Nuclear is always going to be near and dear to my heart, and we know this. Oh boy. Here's the thing about the nuclear world. So this has been my world forever, and it still is to a very large degree. And I love everyone who is in the nuclear arena. Having said that, I think it's a hard space to be, right? Particularly when you're trying to be entrepreneurial and do some new things. And I think one of the things that has been challenging for the nuclear world is that there are so many challenges and so many issues that we faced. The nuclear technology was born out of the Manhattan Project and really a war era sort of technology development space. And so the security concerns, the safety concerns, all of these things are at a very different level than they are for many other climate technologies. And so, for very good reason, I think this is a community that's been focused on those things and understands them and has been designing reactors that are intended to be proliferation resistant and so forth. And while I think all of that is really important, what sometimes gets lost on the nuclear side is the all important and sort of really baseline issue of cost. And so it really comes down to the economics. And I think, I hear from people sometimes they'll ask me questions. Well, their first question is always, what's the deal with thorium, which like is a whole other podcast. But the second question they ask me is like, are we ever going to build any nuclear reactors? Because the thing is that nobody wants them, right? Like the public hates them, and they're all concerned about safety. And my answer is always, that's a factor, but it's not as big as you might think, because the truth is that here in the United States, if you live near a nuclear plant, generally people tend to be very pro-nuclear. They tend to be very good neighbors. They work really hard. They, are very high paying, strong jobs. They tend to anchor their communities. And you see that in other places in the world as well. And obviously, things play out differently depending on the particular country you're in. And we could talk probably a lot about the sort of differences among countries and how public opinion plays out. But at the end of the day, the reason that we're not building more nuclear reactors in the United States, it's really about cost. And so this question of yes or no small modular reactors or micro reactors, or however you want to draw the line on size, really this is a hard-nosed economic question. And the way to think about this is, because nuclear technology comes with some added challenges, particularly in the safety category. There are certain things you have to do. There are certain redundancies that you have to build in the system, not just because regulation requires it, but because, I have one friend, for example, who has been the director of safety at Kairos Power, and he takes his job really dang seriously. It really matters, right? Like, this is important that you do things and that you make these systems as safely as you really can. And so when you do that, there are certain costs associated with that. And then one of the things that happens is you start to realize, as the cost is going up, gee, wouldn't it be nice if I could get more power out of this same unit, because then that helps my revenue side of the equation pan out a little bit better. And lo and behold, you're in a world where a huge reactor winds up making the most economic sense. The flip side of that is, it turns out humans are really bad at building large projects of any sort, and particularly at this level of complexity. So I think these are the economic questions that are starting to play out right now. If you can reduce complexity from a project perspective and make things smaller, but still figure out how to optimize getting as much power as you can, given what you have to do on the safety side, I think that's great. And then I think the other thing that I just really want to point out here is that it's not a foregone conclusion that we can't get better and cheaper than nuclear reactors. If you look at the history of costs of nuclear in the United States and in France, you essentially see negative learning over time historically. And there are a number of reasons for that, again, that we could get into, but it's not the same in Korea and it's not the same in China. They've been able to reduce costs. And part of what we've seen in the United States at the Vogtle plants that are getting built right now just outside of Augusta, Georgia, is the second one is way cheaper and way faster than the first one that they built. So learning happens. It's a question of figuring out how to harness that. It's a question of figuring out how to carefully balance the sort of economic and safety considerations on that side of the equation. And what is really exciting is right now there are a lot of really serious, really incredible people in the nuclear industry, in the startup world, in the nuclear funding world. It's a really exciting place to be. And so I have high hopes that we're going to get this figured out. I can't tell you the exact timeline, because there are a lot of other factors as well around the regulatory side, et cetera. But I think there's some really great work happening now.
Wow, that was really, really interesting. I mean, and the timing of this conversation with Germany just shutting down its last of its plants this week, that was pretty, and people are very passionate about it. It seems to be passion. But I think what I heard you say earlier in the interview is that your goal is reducing greenhouse gases. That is the primary goal. So the question that a lot of folks get wrapped around one is the cost, because these projects are so many years for a large facility that you talk about, and they tend to go up. And the second is it's not renewable.
Mm.
Those are the two kind of things you hear over here in Europe, right?
Sure.
Um, but the smaller modular, I've met a lot of companies sound like doing exciting things, and there seems to be a lot of investment and interest in it.
Yeah.
So I would imagine you must see projects, or you will see projects at that scale as well.
Yeah, I think
But that would
no, I think that's absolutely right. Well, and I think, to those 2 points, I mean, I think this is a little bit of a longer term play. We're not going to start breaking ground on another nuclear plant tomorrow in the United States, but we could for a solar or wind installation, right? So I think recognizing that renewables are and should dominate for the next couple of years, and we should do as much as we can to build as much renewable capacity as possible is a total no-brainer. And then I think once you give nuclear reactors a couple of years to get their feet under them and get to the point that they're ready, they have the potential to play a really important role. So yes, I guess they're not technically renewable, although I think that they are very different from fossil fuel based technologies, both in terms of the resources that they require. They can sort of technically be infinitely recyclable because you make nuclear material even as you use nuclear material, which is sort of a crazy thing, but we could get into all the neutronics therein if we wanted to. And then the other thing is just they have very different characteristics. The one challenge with renewables is they take up a lot of area. So if you're interested in preserving land area, if you don't have a lot of land area resources because you live in Japan or some other country that just doesn't have the resource availability for renewables, nuclear can be a really powerful option. Pun absolutely intended.
And just to clarify, are we going to see an ECI effort in nuclear, or is this more Dr. Lara Pierpoint perspectives on nuclear and associated trends?
That's a great question, Jeff. It's so funny because I actually think about this often, and there are moments when I'm like, we're going to totally do this, and moments when I'm like, I know too much about this industry. I'm like, can I really like, get behind the exact one thing that I'm gonna focus on here? I think it's absolutely possible, though. I think there's some really interesting ideas. There's some efforts, for example, Terra Praxis and some other organizations are leading an effort to explore repowering coal plants with nuclear plants, for example. So there's some really interesting things going on out there, and I think it's not crazy to think there could be an ECI program that's nuclear focused at some point.
Wow. Well, what didn't we cover? I guess we really touched a lot of ground, and I just, again, can't imagine anybody else so seamlessly transitioning from one topic to the next and being able to see the interconnection between the two. And it's just a really fascinating vantage point. So before we wrap, anything else that we didn't touch on that you wanted to highlight?
Oh gosh. One of the things that we didn't talk nearly enough about in this conversation, I think, is the equity piece of the equation here. This is something that uh, you know, we're starting to focus on much more now as a climate and climate tech community. It's obviously an arena that we should have been focused on ever since the dawn of time. But I think it's really important to say that these issues around not just what are we doing, but how are we doing it and who is deciding and how is this impacting people as we go, and particularly people who have been consistently under-resourced. I think it's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle, and it's one that we're trying to be really careful about. So I think my sort of plea to the rest of the world is please please join us in this. I think everyone has it on their minds to some extent, but we're not going to be doing the right thing by all communities and by the people who need it unless we all dig in, and unless it's not just about how diverse is your board of directors. This is about, to what degree does your work acknowledge its impacts on under-resourced communities? To what degree are you asking the question, not how do I solve the problem that exists here in Palo Alto where we need to get 15 more EVs on a circuit that already has 20, but like, how do you think about getting EVs to the people who are in communities that really don't have access to charging? Like, it's about asking the right questions, about solving problems. Right. Because the truth is, not only is this the right thing to do, but if we care about scale and we care about doing this right by the planet, we've got to really turn on its head exactly how we're going to think about and how we're going to actually do the work that we need to do with respect to equity and all folks. So
I want to thank you for being our guest today. This has just been a
yeah.
fantastic show. This has been a lot of fun. I hope we get to talk again in the future. I just really enjoyed it. I know our audience is going to have all kinds of feedback and questions. So this is really exciting. Thank you for being our
Awesome.
guest.
Oh, of course. This was really fun.
For our audience,
I love talking about this stuff, as you can tell. Okay. Is there more I need to record? It looked like you had a prompt for me to
I've
record,
got a
Chris.
prompt for you, but let me just close the
Okay.
show real quick. So for audience, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Insider's Guide to Energy. If you are not a subscriber, please subscribe. Please share content like this with your friends. The more people that know about this, the better. And don't forget to follow us on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.